So, as I mentioned, all of the stuff that I have done in the past 10 years has been rooted in what is now called socially engaged arts practice, historically referred to as community arts. I like to think of this sort of practice as essentially making work with people with a purpose. Art that is sort of socially engaged often tells a story. It might give platform to a specific topic or issue. It might highlight marginalised voices, or it might have a particular social purpose. And that can be something as relatively simple as functioning to bring people together. The thing that defines social practice, I would say, separately from maybe other types of art practice, is the sort of participatory element. So really, it's the work with the people or the communities or the area that's kind of key. So it's that sort of collaborative act of making the work that kind of makes that distinction. So for me, in my practice, the processes, the disciplines that I use are based solely on a sort of gut natural response, really, to the area or the people that I'm working with. And what that means is the physical outcomes of the work that I produce tend to be super varied. So I'm always learning new skills. My work's very multidisciplinary. This has ranged from creating films, photography projects, installations, public sculptures, and lots of kind of interactive works and events. So I would say this field does tend to really branch out people's practices, which can be a little bit daunting, but it can also be a really exciting aspect to the work. So over the past 10 years, this has involved collaborating with absolutely heaps of people. I'm just showing a few examples here. I guess really to show the sort of breadth that this type of work might bring. So I've over the years worked with festivals, worked with a lot of different galleries and arts organisations, as you might typically suspect. But I've also worked with a lot of councils, charities, community interest companies and grassroots organisations. And this has been through a lot of the roles that I sort of outlined at the start of the talk. So I'm going to start now just by talking through a few key projects. And I've divided these up not in sort of a timeline of when I've worked on them, but more in the sort of approach that I've taken. Now, I will say these definitions are not rigid, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But it might be that, for example, you are running something that is participatory, that then blends in something that feels a bit more co-created. It might be that you're working on a commission project, and then after that, actually, it's got an incredible legacy and you continue that work. So I've tried to divide these up into a series of approaches for the purposes of this talk, although I will say none of this work is particularly rigid. So the first approach I'm going to talk to is what's often referred to as participatory practice. It's quite a traditional way of working within socially engaged practice, essentially working with a group of people on a kind of predetermined outcome to a degree. So this was quite a short project that I did in Old Trafford a couple of years ago. It was a photography project. We used analogue photography, and I worked with the mental health support organisation. Worked specifically with people who were suffering from a lot of isolation and perhaps needed a bit of a boost in the confidence, and they might kind of come to the centre to learn new skills. So we did a lot of sort of photo walks. They were all local residents in Old Trafford in Manchester, so they knew that area super well. We decided on a couple of places that we'd go out. We photographed on film, and then we worked collectively to decide what images we'd finally show. So these are all, I think there's about 40 in total. These are all up in permanent display at Blue Sky, which is the support centre. So that was very much about working with people. I got asked to essentially produce something. They were refurbing this beautiful building, and they wanted some work that showed the community. So I decided to approach that in a participatory way, ideally with some sort of benefits to the people that were being involved kind of outside of simply the making process. So next going to move on to a much more ambitious example of participatory project. This is probably the biggest work that I've made to date. So in 2018, I was commissioned by Peel Holdings, who are a huge property company. So they own the likes of the Trafford Centre and a lot of the airports, big property developer in Manchester, and they commissioned me to make a sculpture for my hometown. Now, after a lot of bouncing around ideas, what I decided was that I wanted to create something which really included the people from my hometown. So I grew up in an area called Partington in Trafford, which often has a little bit of a bad rap. In my opinion, it's a beautiful area to live. It has great community spirit, and it's an area that's kind of been continually under-resourced. So having worked a lot in my hometown, I'd done a lot of community work by this time. I reached out to a lot of people I'd worked with, whether that was youth centres, Sure Start centres, elderly people's homes, all of these different kind of buildings, essentially places that I would just be able to go and meet people. And I ran workshops, well, not even necessarily workshops, really. I invited people to come and have their hands cast. So I met with over 600 people, had a bit of a conversation, cast their hand, and then spent about a year and a half making it into this sort of bronze sculpture, which is permanently on display in the area. I was able to run workshops in pretty unusual places. So I did pop-up workshops in the local working men's pub. I did some in a local kebab shop, basically anywhere that someone would let me come with a bucket, pot of alginate, and have a conversation. This was a really lovely project to run because there was a big sort of social side of it. But then actually the sort of building, the bringing of together the work, I did independently. So just two different sort of approaches that you might take on participatory practice. I will say this work was only possible because of the sort of relationships that I'd built in that area. So it meant that I could, one, because I was from that area, you know, I could do this work in quite a authentic way. I'm not quite sure how it would have been received if I was an artist coming into that area, and that's something that is a consideration within social practice. If you're working in certain areas, considering what it is that makes you want to work in that area, do you have connections to it? I wouldn't say that an artist necessarily needs to have immediate ties with an area to work in that place, although it can sometimes be helpful. But it is something to consider when you're approaching a project, just thinking about where it is that you might do that. Okay. So the next thing that I'm going to move on to is an approach called co-creation, which I suppose could be looked at as the sort of level up from participatory practice. So co-creation is very separate to participatory ways of working. The hierarchy between the artist and the participants is lessened, ideally completely removed. The idea of co-creation is that you are approaching something on an equal footing to the people that you're making it with. So that could be something like working with an allotment group, them bringing their own specialisms and you imagining a project together. And you're kind of the facilitator in that role, as opposed to coming in with your own ideas or perhaps ideas that have stemmed from a brief from an organisation. This is a very, very different way of working. One of the projects that I'm going to outline here, I'm going to play probably quite a noisy video, but hopefully it'll do a nice lively start to the morning. So in 2017, I worked with the Whitworth Art Gallery as an artist in residence, and it was just before, I'm not sure if people have been to the Whitworth, but it's got a lovely, beautiful extension on it. So I worked with them in that sort of interim period when they were just refurbing the building. And part of my sort of remit with working with the Whitworth was exploring the gallery collection. They've got an absolutely incredible collection at the Whitworth. So it's kind of looking at that collection in new ways. Myself, I do a lot of techie, visual, sort of video work, and certainly was doing a lot of that work at the time. So that was how I approached it. Part of my remit for working on the residency was to support the creation of a new youth programme, which was called Whitworth Young Contemporaries, which is still going really strong today. And through this residency, I developed lots of new work. And one of the final outcomes was to create a live participatory video performance on the opening night of the Whitworth. We worked with young people over a period of about 18 months. We did lots of pop-up events in Moss Side in different venues, and this was kind of the culmination of some of the stuff that we'd tested. So we worked with the young people to decide on, we decided we wanted to do something live, we wanted to do something really energetic. So we came up with a lineup of musicians. I'm going to show one of these videos in just a moment. And in our event, I had produced a lot of visual work with the young people. So we'd made a lot of these sort of films together. And again, it was produced in a very non-hierarchical way. So we'd kind of be testing stuff out, deciding what we liked, trialing it. If it didn't work, doing it again. So in that way, those young people were kind of coming along with me on a journey of making, and they were kind of learning skills as they went along in the same way I was. So a lot of this co-created imagery was projected into the space. And one of the things that we decided as a group, so myself and the young people, was that we wanted people to be able to add to what we were making on the night. So people were invited to send images and text via different social media channels to us on the night, and that was all live mixed. So I'm just going to play a video. I'm hoping this isn't going to come out super loud.
Here we are, moving like this. And I want like this. See me above this. It's the phone of you. Some of them want them, and we are going the true likeness. Forward, we have to move up, you say the new let's use it to get you moving. I sound like you like best. Tell me who want test. Tell me who want test. Some of them want them, and we are going the true likeness. Forward, we have to move up, you say the new let's use it to get you moving. Use it to get you moving. I sound like you. This is how we started. Great mic, we on the old party. No joke, the show's only half. No figures, I'm stepping in the TARDIS. Fully letting it know I'm a sick artist. When flows connect with you parties, like something you can never lose heart in. Probably want to take part in. Yeah, you put it good, but you're not. Just one left it talk in the spot. Rock more than a few of the tunes that I drop. No, look forward, I'm yes. My mouth is a weapon, projecting words through the real life lessons. And you forgetting the effort.
Okay. So as you can hopefully tell, I'm a short expert. This is a really, really fun, energetic event. It was absolutely privileged to work with some of the young people that I worked with. One of the reasons that I wanted to show that as an example is because I feel that it's a project that I would not have done if I hadn't worked with that specific group. And I also feel that it's a project that really shifted my practice. So previous to this, I had never done a live event before. The idea of doing something that was not practiced or wasn't a film that I could show was utterly terrifying. It's never something that I would have gone down, but it is something that's really, really shaped the work that I've done. So I suppose this is one of the really exciting bits for me for social practice, is that you sort of have to relinquish a lot of that kind of agency over where your work might go, because oftentimes you might work with a group, they might have an idea to do something, you might not know how to do that, but you might be able to find ways to achieve whatever that sort of end goal is. So following this project, I did another residency with an organisation called the Heart of Glass. If anyone has never heard of or worked with the Heart of Glass, they're an absolutely fantastic organisation. They do some brilliant socially engaged work. So in a residency that I did with the Heart of Glass, it was part of my remit to work with young people. A lot of the work I do over the years has been with young people. I find them very energetic and fun types of people to work with. So I had that particular sort of parameter to my work. I knew that I'd be working in St Helens and working with young people. Beyond that, it was very, very open. So I began probably quite traditionally in the way that you would working with young people. I went into schools, we did a couple of workshops, and I got together a group of young people who would then work with us over a long time period. However, alongside this, while I was working in the community, I met a group of young lads who were doing a lot of parkour at the time. Most of the young men in the group were involved in the criminal justice system. They were sort of jumping off buildings, setting buildings on fire. There was quite a lot of kind of issues there, and they were quite a vulnerable group. I was really keen to work with this group of young men. It felt to me that they absolutely had a lot to offer, and perhaps maybe had not been given that opportunity to be involved in a project such as this. So whilst I was working with one group in a particular way, in quite a traditional way, I suppose, creating lots of work, we ended up doing lots of pop-up exhibitions in St Helens Town Centre. I also worked with this group. And the reason that I wanted to talk about this specific project is because, similarly to the Whitworth project, although arguably a next sort of layer of that, I really had to approach this with a real knowledge that I might not have the skills or specialisms to necessarily work with these young men in the way that they would want. But I knew that I did have some skills that they might find useful and hopefully be interested in. So I worked with a group. We went out, we did filming, we learned kind of techie skills, we learned little bits of coding, we learned lots of kind of image manipulation techniques. And what we decided to do was to do a parkour performance in their local area. So I worked with a building company to get a load of scaffold, learned how to put scaffold up. We built a set, and I also got in a professional parkour performer as well to work with the lads. So I was able to work with them. We came up with a narrative for the show. We collaboratively made all of the visuals, and really the agency on the work was kind of put on to those young people, you know, so it's a very youth-led project. This is, I suppose, another way in which you might approach social practice. You might meet a group, they might have a particular interest, and I suppose as the artist in that situation, you can either run with that, you know, you might want to shape it to a particular degree. Although I will say in some projects that are completely led by the people you're working with, it can be a little bit of a frightening way of working, but it can often deliver the most exciting outcomes. Another thing to mention within social practice, people often talk about the impact of work as well. And for me, that's one of the most rewarding things about working in this area, is sometimes seeing that impact on a group or on an individual that you've worked with. And that can be something as simple as actually encouraging someone to leave the house that might be isolated. It might be as simple as giving someone a new skill that they might be able to use in an entrepreneurial business. Or in relation to this project, you know, some of these young men actually ended up going back to school and sitting their GCSEs, and I think this project did sort of add to that, really, because it gave them something very positive to focus on, and somewhere positive to put their energies. The next co-created project that I would like to show is a feature-length film. I made this a good few years ago now, I think it was 2016. I made this project very early on in my career on a super small budget with a naff secondhand £300 camera that I'd saved up for. I was approached by Stronger Families, who are a family support agency for Trafford Council, that work with vulnerable families for all heaps of reasons, to give kind of holistic support. So they approached me about doing a project for International Women's Day. What transpired is that I ended up working with a specific group of young women that had suffered and survived domestic violence, and together we decided that we wanted to make a film about the local area, focusing on women's experiences. As I mentioned earlier, the area that I grew up has a bit of a bad rap locally, so that was something that we kind of wanted to show a different side to, I suppose. I worked with the women on all aspects of film creation, interviews, coming up with a narrative. They helped me film, we edited the film together, and it was shown at a local cinema space and has since been shown at a number of film festivals. I'm going to show a very short excerpt from this film. I'm deliberately showing a specific part of it, so just to say there won't be any trigger warnings, I'm just going to play the first sort of 5 minutes introduction just to give you a bit of an idea. And you'll notice when you watch this, you know, it's not the best made film necessarily. We didn't have great kit to make it with. But that wasn't something that necessarily halted or, in my opinion, lowered the sort of quality of a project. So again, just something to bear in mind, you know, if there's something that you want to do, it's great to have a decent budget and to be able to make things to a really high quality. But equally, try not to let that stop you trying something out or doing the work, because it's better to do the work than not.
Why are you bothering cleaning up? Well, I've lived in Partington for over 50 years. Yeah, so we were one of the first families that actually came here. When we came, it was just all fields and different things. The school was not even built.
The people, because we are people are nice lot of people here. A lot of them are working class, but they're good, solid working class. Some lovely people. Yeah, I think some of the nicest people I've ever met live here.
When you live in Partington, nobody thinks you're going to do anything. Women are expected to just grow up and have kids and not do anything with their lives.
Grown up in an area like this in Partington, and people understand that we all have challenges in life, actually makes you a better person and has given me more power and more drive to do more with myself.
Partington is a brilliant village, absolutely brilliant. If it wasn't, I wouldn't be here. I'd have gone long ago. But I brought my kids up here on my own. I'm happy.
And I think personally, if people could appreciate women have got a lot to share. But women themselves have to liberate themselves, not to allow to be downtrodden, to be downtrodden by other people saying you are just a woman. Because I think we've got brains which function very well if we can allow ourselves to function and not hear this voice, oh, you're only a woman. But a woman can do fantastic things, I think, if they are helped to realize that they shouldn't think that they are second-class citizens.
I mean, I'm not from here and I'm not a Partington girl, but I've met some brilliant people and friends.
We grew up here. I was 3 when I came to Partington, and I absolutely loved every moment of it. And I think everybody did, because we were all in the same home.
Yeah, everybody was just exactly the same. Everybody had nothing, but everybody had everything.
Can you describe how Partington was when you were younger?
I remember the carnival day. That was the big thing. So you had all the rides and everything. You had all the dancing troupes that used to come, and everybody raid.
It was more friendly and more close community, I think. Yeah, the neighbours, you could talk to your neighbours more over the fence, or they used to pop in, you used to have your door open.
I found it was a happy place. It was. It was very much village-like for me. I can remember the Oak Road being hills.
Yeah, before all those houses.
Yeah, before all the houses, we used to go running up and down them hills, and it was just a lovely place. I'm so glad I grew up here. Let's put it that way. I wouldn't change it.
You walked out your garden and you knew everybody.
Yeah.
What made you happy as a child?
There didn't seem to be any boundaries when I was a kid. You could do what you wanted because you knew that everybody looked after you.
When the kids, we used to go for walks on the woods and everything, we were all like, wow, this is just like behind your house. And it was mad with a little stream and everything. You know, anything like that where I grew up. And going in the farmers' fields, we put it, getting strawberries. And my gran used to get blackcurrants and make blackcurrant jam.
And you go off across fields, and when I think now, I feel sick thinking about it. But I didn't see any danger.
Helping out, going on the float, helping my dad set up a float on the tractor and trailer for the carnival.
Oh, yeah, it was great. I tell you, I wouldn't change it for the world.
On the ferry, do you remember
the ferry?
The ferry boat.
The ferry.
When the hypermarket was built, and we used to go over on the ferry boats to Tesco's to do the shopping. My mum used to send me and my sister on the ferry boat with the wheelie basket to go and do the shopping. Can you imagine now asking your kids?
Quick save.
Yeah.
We used to go over, we'd go, we'll wait till you get back. Hey, you'll be up and down the bleeding ferry.
Well, and his wife would shout over, it's just having his tea.
I think they do
pulled together and just everybody knows everybody. So there is that just community, even if you might not see somebody for ages, but then you might see them a year or so later, but it's as if you've seen them every day. I think it's quite friendly. It's nice. And like I say, I've been here years and I don't think I would need to move or want to move.
People years ago, you remember this, Nana. You say you're from parties and you go, oh,
yeah, such a bad reputation.
And it didn't.
And it still has. That reputation has stuck.
It's stuck.
All those years.
Yeah.
People don't want to come to parties because it's got such a bad reputation. That's fine because
they don't know it.
Yeah, it's
they don't know it, and that's and that's as far as it goes.
It's got that lovely community spirit, and it's still got that nice community spirit. Hasn't it?
Yeah, but people need to go because we used to go sometimes. Quite.
It's
quite all right.
One of the most exciting things about making that film was the people that I met through it. The reason that I wanted to sort of flag up this piece, despite it being quite an old piece of work, was because I feel that it shows the kind of breadth of benefits that a project like this can have. But it also sort of highlights, again, some considerations that you might need to bear in mind when creating this type of work. So this project was really successful in the respect that it was produced in a completely non-hierarchical way. The women that I worked with were involved from sort of project idea conception right down to making sure we had enough popcorn on our launch night at the local cinema. So it felt extremely, it felt like an extremely embedded way of working as well. I think partially perhaps because I was from the area. It's also a piece of work that would not have been possible had I not worked with that specific group of women. Together, we had enough of us that we could ask essentially every local woman we knew if they'd be up for getting in front of a camera. And I suppose most importantly, it's a piece of work that I don't think I could have made on my own in an authentic way. And this is something that we're going to touch a little bit on in the second part of the talk, but it's a big consideration in making socially engaged work, especially if you are telling people stories, because it's important that if you are using your work to tell stories, to potentially platform marginalised voices, to talk about an area, to talk about a specific community, those people need to be involved, and they need to be involved from the offset. Because it can get very, very, even with the best intentions, if the people that you are making work with and about are not involved in it, it can bring in a whole host of issues. It can potentially offend, it can potentially marginalise these particular communities further. And frankly, nobody wants their own experiences being used or platformed in a way that, you know, is irrelevant to them. It can also be at risk of kind of mining people's experiences as well. This was a really exciting project. The women that I worked with seemed to get quite a lot out of it, both in the sort of soft skills that we learn and in some sort of practical skills. So the next approach that I will be talking through is a research-based approach. So this piece here was made as part of a wider body of work in a sort of second residency that I did with the Heart of Glass in St Helens. It was made during the lockdown, so it was kind of adapted based on the fact that we were all stuck in our houses on screens. At that time, I was doing work around children's rights, so I was looking at the UN's Children's Charter of Rights. St Helens had sadly failed its Ofsted for children's services for the 5th year running. And they were really trying as council to make the area a better place for children and young people. So I used some of that research and I also collected over 2,000 postcards from young people in St Helens, sharing their likes, dislikes, concerns, fears, and hopes for the future in the area that they lived. So this sculpture here is a kind of visualization of that feedback, sort of giving a bit of a nod to stained glass, although it's not glass, it's resin, because it was stored in places that we didn't want glass shuttering onto children, but kind of bringing in St Helens sort of industry there as well. So this is another way in which you might approach socially engaged practice, is by gathering research in whatever field you're working in and potentially try and sort of visualize that. Hopefully, as I'm going through this, you can see how different those sort of approaches are. So a project that sort of brings essentially two approaches together. A research-based project, but it also brings in kind of multidisciplinary collaboration. So I was asked a number of years ago to work with Take Back Theatre. If you were into the theatre, I would strongly suggest you look them up. They are a great bunch of people. And they make rapid response theatre work in response to all kinds of social issues, predominantly austerity. And they also do a great job of kind of giving platform to marginalised voices. The work is extremely political. So I was invited to join them on a journey to produce a show called Belonging, which was an immersive theatre show at Hope Mill Theatre. And as part of this, we were using data from Manchester Met's Migration Lab, who kind of pulled together all types of information about migration, and that's including kind of people to birds, essentially researching how people and humans and non-humans sort of navigate our world. So as part of this, I was given a whole body of research, and I wanted to make something that really brought home the migrant crisis time. So what I did, I had sheets and sheets, and on these sheets, it was people's names, and it was the stuff that they'd brought with them had they time to pack. And what I did was I recreated the suitcases they had brought down to a T. So if they had a tissue in there, the tissue was noted. If they had a life jacket, that was noted. If the phone was wet, I bought a phone and I dumped it in some water. So I tried to create these as realistically as possible. I then worked with some Manchester-based actors, and I had them read out the descriptions of the things that people had brought in these suitcases and the reasons they had bought them. So as people came to the show, so there was lots and lots of different aspects of it. The image you can see here on the far left is, I think, the beginning of the show, and people kind of brought round into the theatre. And really one of the aims that we wanted to do with this work was to bring home that actually war is something that could happen to anyone. So as people came around this specific piece, all of these sort of audio clips were triggered by motion sensors, and they could kind of hear these stories from people in their own dialect. So, of course, with this project, I was working off research. I think when you're working off research, it's very, very important to check your sources to make sure that these things are creditable, to know where that information's come from. And it was also collaborative in the respect that I was working with lots of different actors, theatre makers, set designers, and also 3 different organisations. This next project that I'm going to talk about kind of brings together the last 3 approaches that we've sort of covered. So it's a research-based project. All of the work was co-created, and it relied heavily on collaboration. So that was collaborating with the groups of people that I was working with, and also other artists. So the next term was a year-long research project, which came about, I suppose, from a frustration of the struggles that I was seeing in education at that time. So I worked with two other artists who also worked a lot in arts education. And what we were seeing, which to be frank is probably worse now, was the consistent underfunding of creative subjects within schools. and a real lack of awareness around sort of transferable skills that creative subjects bring to young people. So we decided to try and do something about it, to give a bit of a platform to this issue that we all felt very strongly about, but we were also aware that we were not experts in that field. So we began the project very loosely by trying to connect with people, to connect with policymakers, teachers, young people, to really get a sort of holistic idea, I suppose, of what is a really complex subject. We produced a real range of works in response to the research that we'd conducted, and we presented this at a 2-day festival. About halfway through the project, we realised that what we wanted to do was to make it quite a forward-looking project. So whilst the work that we created really gave reference and gave platform to some of the issues that had come forward in our conversations with teachers, with young people, we wanted to do something that felt forward thinking. So we created a 2-day festival all about the future of education. I'm just going to show a very short clip of this to give you a bit of a feel of what we've produced.
We know this system doesn't work. It creates workload and it creates immense stress for everybody.
And I want to sort of put the party political point scoring to the bottom because this is too big a crisis. This is a bipartisan crisis, the British crisis.
Putting facts down their throat will not help them. Taking them to museums, taking them on trips, focusing purely on knowledge is going to undermine their capacity to move forward.
Increasing class sizes in the way that's happening, cutting down the subject choices that are offered to young people. These are much more damaging to children in the long term.
It's a certain type of knowledge that does really benefit from being examined within an exam style setup. It's positive to put young people in a situation where they have to where they have to be time limited. There's a place for it. Where there isn't a place for it is in subjects where it has absolutely no relevance.
You know, within school, I think you're conditioned to learn and specific facts and figures and things and do things in a certain way and follow a certain trajectory and go, okay, well, this is how you succeed this way. If I gave you a map with a route on it, you just follow that route and you'd always follow that route and you'd never go anywhere else. But I gave you a compass and when you need to get from A to B, you've got to find your own way. And then in that way, along that way, you might discover things on that route.
Well, we're already just teaching them to jump through loops, really. That is what we're just preparing for exams.
It just sounded like we were being pushed into a box of what they wanted from us to literally just pass the course. And like schools are now exam factories.
There's different types of smart and different types of intelligence, and everybody is intelligent in some way. Everybody has the gift of intelligence. Some people just haven't had that gift unwrapped yet.
So some of the, well, all of the voices that you heard in the documentation video were all recordings from interviews that we'd conducted. Some of the works that you might have seen within the show all of those works, physical works, were made in relation, kind of inspired by some of those issues. So we created a kind of infinite library. Libraries are closing by the week within schools at the moment. We made a piece out of a lot of instruments that had been taken from school that had cancelled their GCSE maths due to GCSE music due to funding. The piece that you saw everybody throwing the paper planes through was a bit of a tongue-in-cheek work that we called Jumping Through Hoops, which was super well received on the day, because I think people like making paper planes and chucking them around. And we made a giant paper plane, which was the sort of structure that you could see in that film, which was a bit of a sort of soundscape installation that people could kind of walk through and hear about the experiences of people. So that was a really nice, successful project. But similarly to most of the projects that I've spoken about today, it is not something that I, as a single artist, could have done on my own. It's certainly not something that I could have done well on my own. So the last thing that I'm going to talk to in this first section, and then we're going to stop for a 5-minute comfort break. I'm just going to finish on some kind of current and upcoming projects. So stuff that I'm working on at the moment. I've worked with an organisation called In Situ in Pendle for a number of years now. Absolutely fantastic organisation. If you are not aware of them, they do some wonderful work, and they work in a very special way with their local community. They're a very embedded organisation. I'm working with In Situ over the next year, exploring art in the landscape, working with communities in rural settings. I'm also working on a commission with Lightworks in Blackpool to develop some new work. And the last thing that I'll be working on as it stands over the next couple of months is creating a multi-sensory room working with early years families. All of these things are very, very different. And I think when you're working in this sort of field, oftentimes you really have to switch your brain around. But I will say is that it does keep your ideas quite fresh. I'm someone who gets very excited about things very quickly, and I quite like sort of jumping around. Everyone works very, very differently, but it is something to consider when working in this practice, really trying to understand how you work and how different approaches might best fit your practice. Because what I will say, what works for me might not work for another practitioner. We're just going to do a very short, we're going to have a very short comfort break now. And then when we get back, we're just going to be covering some of the practicalities and kind of considerations in a bit of a sort of wider theme. I'm going to just talk through some considerations that you might want to be thinking about when you're making this sort of work. And then I'm going to open it to the room for a bit of a Q&A, but really, hopefully, a bit of a more open discussion, really, kind of group discussion, just to unpick some of the things that we've gone through this morning. Okay, so the first thing you might want to think about when approaching a project like this is thinking about your starting point. So how are you going to begin making that work? What effects might that have on the process or the outcome? And how are you going to practically do it? So one of the ways you might do that, quite a traditional way, being commissioned by an organisation. Someone might approach you and say, hey, I've got this idea, got this group of people, got this pot of funding, I want to make something, will you work with me? It might be that it's something that you found online that you sort of apply to. You have to put a proposal forward through. Typically, quite a common way of starting this sort of work. Another way that you might start a project is to self-initiate something. So it might be that you yourself have a particular idea, or it might be that you know that you want to work in a specific area or on a specific topic, or with a particular group of people. What you might do in that situation is you might approach an organisation, you know, such as the Turnpike, or any organisation that you think you might like to work with, and you might say to them, I've got this idea of something that I want to do, will you work with me on it? They might say no, they might say yes, they might say try and get some funding and come back to us, but it's always worth thinking about. The nice thing about working in organisations, especially if they're an organisation that shares similar values, similar ways of working to yourself. It can be really nice to have those additional collaborators around you to kind of help sense check stuff. Can also be really great ways of kind of linking in with communities. And of course, all the other lovely support that an organisation would offer. Another way in which you might start a project is self-initiate something and actually just lead it yourself. You might think, I don't need to work with an organisation. I know where I want to work. I know what I want to do. Might already have some of those relationships. I'm just going to go ahead and do it. If you fall into this third category, what I would always say is it's always good to get a bit of advice, whether that's from a colleague or a friend, fellow artist, whether it's your partner, whoever that person is, just to kind of sense check yourself when you're working, and also to essentially stop you going down rabbit holes. I think, you know, if you're doing something and it's only you doing it, sometimes that can be great, but it is nice to have a bit of a soundboard, so it's something to bear in mind. If it is a project that you have initiated, you're probably going to want paying, assuming most people have bills and like eating and, you know, need to cover the day to day. So you're probably going to want to look at different funding options. I'm not going to talk heaps about funding today because I think it's probably its own separate area. But what I will say is consider the sort of funding that you might want to go for and be quite specific. So don't always go for necessarily the most obvious funders. So it's a great time to be making socially engaged work at the moment, in the respect that it's very high on the priority of Arts Council England, which is great. That work is really being recognised across galleries and across funders. But these are really competitive funds, and they might not necessarily be the best trajectory for your project. So do try and look a bit wider. For example, if you are doing a project around mental health, it might be that you apply for specific mental health funding. If you're doing a project around climate activism, it might be that you apply for funding that very specifically focuses on that as an aim. What I will say is do try and find funding partners that actually really match your own interests, because, you know, they will be looking at things like, why does it make sense for that funder to work with you at this time? Why does it make sense for you to be working in that area? I'm really just trying to consider that when you're looking at support revenues for your work. There's really good support available online for funding for artists. You could be the most incredible, impactful, socially engaged artist, and you might be a bit crap at writing a funding bid, and that's fine. They're not always the easiest things to navigate, especially if you as someone that's not used to that way of working. So do use what's out there. There's some great resources, which could we send those to the invitees online as well? I'd be happy to send a list over to some resources that I think can be really useful for applying for funding, but there is absolutely heaps out there. A lot of organisations do dedicated fund writing sessions as well. So if it is something that you want to do, I would strongly encourage going along with that because it demystifies it a little bit. So the next thing that I'd like to talk through is the main considerations that you might have when you're thinking about approaching a project. So what, who, where, why, what are we doing, why are we doing it, and who are we doing it with and for? So one thing you might want to consider, what's the work about? What does it seek to achieve? What's the sort of social impact of that? Is it raising awareness about a specific area? Is it giving platform to a specific community? Is the impact a specifically social thing? Is your work about bringing people together? Where is the work being made and where will it be shown? Both very, very equally important things to be thinking of. The where will it be shown part is a big consideration, in my opinion, of socially engaged practice, because it does really, it can often change how the work is seen. So something to really consider when you're approaching a project, yeah, where will it be shown? Who will it be shown to? And I suppose how are the people that you have made the work with included in that conversation? Who will you work with to create the work? That could include a specific group of people. It might include other artists, it might include organisations, but again, just really thinking about these things in a critical way and why are you making the work. Now, it might be that you approach a project and you only have the answer to one of these questions. In my opinion, that's fine. These might shift. So, for example, you might have a really strong idea. You know why you're making the work. You have a really strong idea of a point that you want to get across or something that you want to give platform to, but you might not know the who, where, what. Equally, you might know that there is a specific group of people that you want to collaborate with, that you want to work with. You might not know what you're making with them. That's kind of fine as well. But really, you should have an idea of one of these as a starting point. And then you can kind of slot the others in, you know, as you sort of meet people, as your ideas develop. Okay. The next thing that I would like to talk through is some kind of further practical considerations. And I'm just going to go through these. There is a lot to consider within socially engaged practice. No two projects are ever the same. I will say when I was putting this together last week, this list was about 3 A4 pages long. So I've really had to reduce it down, but hopefully covers some of the main things that you might want to think about. So the first thing is taking time to consider and learn from those you are working with. So really that's ensuring if you're making work with a community or group of people, that those people are included from the offset and that they're consulted and valued. So it's really about sort of taking time to work with other people and making sure that you're doing that not in a lip service way, in a very, very genuine way. Value your time and the time of others. So being realistic with your time. Everything always takes longer than you think, which is still something that I have not really taken on board, but it does. And whether that's building relationships, whether it's actually create a piece of work, it always takes longer than you think. So do try and plan in realistic timelines. Be reliable and respect your commitments that you've made. If you're working with a group of young people and you have told them you are going to meet them every Monday night, be reliable, stick to that, respect that commitment you've made. Oftentimes that's where relationships can really break down. You know, really valuing the time that other people have put into their projects, making sure that you're prepared for workshops, you know, all of these things are very, very important. Be open about project parameters. If you know you're doing a 6-month project, say that from the offset, that's fine. You know, it's probably unrealistic that a project would go on forever. So just be really open with people you're working with about any parameters to the project. Likewise, if there's parameters about what you are making. So if you know that you have been commissioned to do a photographic project, you're doing workshops with people around that, and that work's going to be shown in a specific setting. Outline those project parameters. If it is a project that is completely open, you're working with a group and you go, hey, don't know what we're going to do yet, but I'm going to get ideas from you. I'm going to give you some ideas. We're going to work together. We're going to come up with something. Again, put out those open parameters. But what I would be wary of is working with people and saying, oh, we could do anything, you know, because I think actually those parameters can be quite a good way to sort of safeguard yourself and also just manage the expectations of the people that you're working with. Project planning, building in reflection points and adapt as needed. If an idea really isn't working, don't be afraid to completely change it. Don't see that as a sort of failure of your own planning. Different things will work well with different projects. And actually, it's much better to kind of chuck away your plans and start from scratch if something really isn't gelling or working in the way that you want it to. The next thing to do is really trust the process. And I think this gets easier with time as you run projects. I think in a lot of projects that I've worked on, or in a lot of projects that I've worked on as a producer, supporting other artists, there's always this sort of period in a project, and it's normally about half to a third of the way through where people go, oh, you know, I feel like we've done loads, but I've got loads of work and we're showing. And, you know, I think it's good to have milestones in place. It's good to have ways of checking in with yourself so that you know that you're at a stage that you want to be at, but do trust that project, you know, do trust that process, because it will come, and it's a different way of working as well. So things might just take a little bit more time. Considering the end point of a work, of a project is very important, and putting in stages as well, especially if you're working with vulnerable groups. Being really clear about participants from the start of the longevity of the project, and also really do try and think of potential legacies to the work. Not all projects might have a legacy, and that's fine. But it might be that you've worked with a group and, you know, they're at a stage where really they might be able to continue creating work without you there. They might need some support to do that. It might be that if you are working with a gallery, for example, that, you know, after your project is finished, that you could signpost them to another activity or another group they could be involved with. So just something to think about. If you know that it's something you really want to continue, do try and make steps to start that before your project ends, because sometimes that sort of in-between stage can be a little bit tricky as well. If projects have had a real momentum and then they need to sort of stop. So do try and sort of reach out if there's things that you do want to continue, just to see how practical that might be. Last two things, get advice as needed. I would say, especially if you're working in areas that are sensitive or particularly specialist. The great thing about the arts, and I would say, you know, a lot of other sectors that I've worked in, is people are generally quite generous with their time. You know, if you're respectful of their time, they will answer questions, or they might be able to point you in the right direction for specific resources. But this is incredibly important, I think, especially from a sort of safeguarding point of view, and to make sure that your projects are as good as they can be. And the last one, nope, I'm not going to go into that one yet. Okay, I'm going to finish up with some final thoughts. The area of social practice is an absolutely massive one, and there is heaps of further reading that you can do on the subject, and all practitioners work very, very differently. Hopefully today's been useful to kind of understand some of the approaches that you might take. Some final thoughts on socially engaged practice. Understanding and appreciating the specialisms of others is really, really important. For me personally, it's quite important in my own practice that I work without hierarchy. So I try to approach every project with the knowledge that whilst I have specialisms and skills in some areas, they are no different to the specialism, skills, experiences that people I'm working with might bring. That can be anything from, if I'm making a piece of work about an environmental topic, understanding that an ecologist will likely have much more of an idea about that specialism area than me. Or it could also be a little bit more research based than that. So a project that I'm currently doing where I'm making a permanent sensory room, I'm working with babies and parents and carers to understand how they react to certain things that we sort of built. So I'm kind of testing out work with them, understanding that babies are a specialist in being a baby. You know, that's an experience that for a long time I have not known much about. So really kind of working in a way that is appreciating other people's specialisms, other people's experiences, and actually being able to co-create in a really sort of genuine way around. That's a really good starting point. Embrace and enjoy creative tangents. Socially engaged practice can be a real drive for expanding your own processes and working in a really multidisciplinary way, if you are open to working in that way. Do try and expand your skills and comfort zone. If you're working in a particular group and you feel you've not got the skills to do a specific thing, try and find other people that you might connect with, or try and find workarounds in regards to that. Build your networks, whatever that means to you. So that might be connecting a lot with grassroots local organisations. It might be building networks in a specific subject area. It might be building networks with your peers. So everybody in the room here hopefully has come because they have an interest in socially engaged practice. This is a network. You all live very locally to one another. And I would encourage everybody at the end of today to kind of stick around and speak to a couple of people as well. Building networks is a really valuable thing because it enables you to look a bit more outwardly in terms of the practice. And lastly, give it a go and work with what you have. Work with the budgets you have. Work with whatever kit that it is you want to use. If you've got an idea, try and find ways to test it out if it's not something that you're too sure of, ideally in quite an unpressured way. And that can be a really nice way of just ironing out the creases or potential issues that kind of might arise. And gain feedback from your peers, whether that is in a formal setting. There's some really interesting artist development programs happening in the Northwest, so it could be through joining something like that, or it could be on a one-to-one basis. But do try and speak about your work as well, because it's a really good way of kind of sense checking what you're doing. Thank you.